Thank you very much, Brendan, and thanks everyone for participating today. Thank you so much to the Hamilton Coalition Against War for inviting me. Um, and with the time I've got, I'd just like to talk about the journey that US-China relations have taken over the years. We talk about there being a new Cold War currently, but China was also one of the key targets of the original Cold War. In terms of the rise of McCarthyism, the extreme militant anti-communism of the Truman administration, the genocidal war against Korea, a great deal of this was connected to the whole so-called loss of China discourse. How could US imperialism just helplessly allow the most populous country in the world, a country of massive historical and strategic importance, to have a communist revolution, to join the socialist camp, to enter into an alliance with the Soviet Union? So one of the early acts of the Cold War was actually to prevent the People's Republic of China from taking up its rightful place at the United Nations. Between 1949 and 1971, it was the so-called Republic of China, that is to say, the breakaway capitalist dictatorship in Taiwan, that represented China on the Security Council and on the General Assembly. And so for those 2 decades, relations between the US and China were characterized by outright hostility and an attempt by the US to blockade China militarily, economically, diplomatically. Then, in the early 1970s, strategists in the US decided on this path of engaging with China for a variety of reasons, including that its old policy of non-recognition just wasn't viable, especially given the type of support that China enjoyed among the newly liberated countries in Africa and elsewhere. But the most important reason was almost certainly that the US thought that it could strengthen its position vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, which by this point was involved in a bitter ideological dispute and a split with China that lasted from the early 1960s until the late 80s. So, as is well known, Kissinger visited Beijing in 1971, Richard Nixon visited Beijing in 1972, and on the last evening of Nixon's visit, the two sides issued the Shanghai Communique, affirming that the US and China would work towards normalizing relations and acknowledging the One China policy as the basic framework for that normalization. From then onwards, the trajectory of US-China relations was towards greater and greater cooperation. Sino-American relations were officially normalized in 1979. China's economic reform and opening up process created opportunities for a lot of US businesses to make fabulous profits in China. Trade volume increased from around $100 million per year in 1972 to around $600 billion in 2020. That is, it's increased by a factor of around 6,000. So up until around a decade ago, there was this trajectory of more and more friendship, more and more cooperation. Of course, the two countries were never allies as such. Western media never entirely gave up on tropes about Chinese authoritarianism. They never stopped supporting separatist movements in Taiwan. And ultimately, they never gave up on their ambition to roll back the Chinese Revolution. Certainly, they had assumed China would go the same way as the Soviet Union and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. Certainly, they had very high hopes that the Tiananmen protests in 1989 would turn into some kind of full-scale counter-revolution. However, all in all, the relationship was characterized by a rising, mutually beneficial cooperation, and that has changed pretty dramatically in the last few years. And what precipitated that change? The main thing, the central thing, is that China has become stronger. The West was happy to incorporate China into a globalized capitalism, so long as China was content to remain at the bottom of the hierarchy, providing cheap labor to manufacture the t-shirts that are worn on the streets of New York, the streets of London, the streets of Hamilton. But strategically, the US has always had an eye towards preserving its position at the top of the system of international relations, what the US likes to call the rules-based international order, and what people who understand such matters call the US-led imperialist system. We're talking about the new Cold War now, but actually this was what the original Cold War was about as well. It was a system of hybrid warfare against the socialist countries and against the developing world. It was a war to consolidate and expand US hegemony. It was a war to ensure a friendly global business environment, allowing the US capitalist class and its close allies to extract profits, to grab resources, to grab land, to develop markets, to enjoy cheap labor throughout the world. And President Truman summed it up pretty well in 1947 when he said, "We can survive only if the whole world adopts the American system." That was the overarching rationale behind the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the coups in Indonesia, in Brazil, in Chile, in Guatemala, the support for apartheid regimes in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the blockade on Cuba, and so on. Now, the Cold War putatively ended in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, but US ambitions of preserving and consolidating and expanding its hegemony didn't go away. The world was supposed to be enjoying some kind of peace dividend following the conclusion of the Cold War, but what we got instead was genocidal wars against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. We got NATO's expansion. We got AFRICOM. We've come dangerously close to war on Iran. Now, by the time Obama arrived in the White House in 2008, it was quite obvious that China stood in the way of the project for a new American century. And now, 14 years later, it's only more evident that China is leading the way towards a multipolar world order and constitutes, on that basis, a quite real impediment to the plans of US imperialism. China is on the cusp of overtaking the US as the world's largest economy. In purchasing power parity terms, it already has done. China's the leading trade partner of nearly 3/4 of the world's countries. China's becoming a science and technology powerhouse. It's the unquestioned world leader in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, in telecommunications. It's among the world leaders in nanotechnology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, space exploration, advanced manufacturing. It's playing the leading role in the battle against climate breakdown. Living conditions have improved to an extraordinary degree. China's life expectancy actually has now just surpassed that of the United States. It's established friendly, mutually beneficial relationships with countries around the world, especially the global south, and those countries that refuse to go along with US diktat, including Russia, including Iran, including Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Belarus, the DPRK, and many more. So, China's loudly promoting a multipolar system in which the sovereignty of all countries is respected, where all countries have a voice, a system in which the imperialist powers can't simply use wars at will, use sanctions at will, destabilization, economic coercion in order to impose their will on the planet. Therefore, China has become, in the eyes of the US, a very serious threat, the number one enemy. That's the reason for the new Cold War. That's the reason for Obama's pivot to Asia. That's the reason for Trump's trade war. That's the reason for AUKUS and for the Biden regime's undermining of the One China principle. What we have now is a quite extensive strategy of containment and encirclement. That includes an increasing US military presence in the South China Sea. It includes this attempt to build a whole set of anti-China alliances, including AUKUS, including the Quad, and essentially moving in the direction of some kind of global NATO. It includes economic warfare, sanctions, attempting to get Huawei removed from network infrastructure worldwide, desperately trying to prevent China from reaching parity with the US in terms of semiconductors. It includes deploying the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, the THAAD system, in South Korea and Guam. It includes establishing a US military base in Darwin in North Australia, encouraging the remilitarization of Japan, sending warships through the Taiwan Strait, sending Nancy Pelosi to Taipei, and not to forget a systematic slander campaign accusing China of genocide in Xinjiang, accusing China of violating the national rights of the peoples of Tibet, Inner Mongolia and elsewhere, accusing China of suppressing democracy in Hong Kong, accusing China of engaging in imperialism in Africa, in Latin America, in the Pacific, in the Caribbean. So this is a multifaceted attack. It's a hybrid war. Many people hope that with a flagrantly racist Donald Trump gone from the White House and no longer having this major platform to talk about Kung Flu and China supposedly raping our economy, the situation might improve. And sad to say, it hasn't. Joe Biden has followed an essentially Trumpian position with regard to most aspects of foreign policy, US-China relations included. Biden said it very clearly in one of his first speeches as president. He said, China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch. So Biden's continuing the trade war. He's escalating sanctions. He's selling more weapons to Taiwan. He's encouraging separatist forces in Taiwan. He's echoing these disgraceful slanders about human rights in Xinjiang. He's launched AUKUS. He's attempting to divide the world into countries that are, by his definition, democratic and those that are authoritarian in order to build a kind of ever tighter imperialist alliance against China and Russia. All this is leading the world in a very dangerous direction. Humanity faces serious existential threats in the form of climate breakdown, pandemics, and the possibility of nuclear war. The insistence of the US ruling class, and I have to say very sadly that this insistence is completely bipartisan. It's a consensus opinion in Washington on maintaining its global hegemony is a very serious impediment to facing those threats that we all collectively face. As such, it's crucial and it's urgent that progressive and peace-loving people the world over join hands in building global mass opposition to this insanity. Thank you very much.